So guys, so we're still looking at program implementation, but today we'll be looking at commonly used terms in programming. But before we actually divulge this topic, let me say that if there's something that is said or done in this particular video that you do not understand, feel free to leave a comment below and I will respond as soon as possible. Additionally, if you're having problem with any particular topic in your IT syllabus, feel free to shoot me an email at it_rmorgan@yahoo.com and I will respond video wise as soon as possible. Now, without further delay, let us jump into today's topic. Now, as mentioned before, we'll basically be looking on commonly used programming terms. The first term that we'll be looking at is what we call testing, right? And testing is basically checking a program for errors. Let me repeat. Testing is basically checking a program for errors. Simple, don't? Exactly, cool. Let's move on. The next term that we'll be looking at is execute, right? And execute is running a program to see the results. Very simple. So testing is checking a program for errors. Execute is running a program to see the results. Cool? Now the next term that you should know is debugging. But before we actually talk about what debug is, let us find out what a bug actually is. Now in programming world, a bug is actually an error in a program. You get that? In programming concept and programming, a bug is basically an error in a program. So if you're debugging a program, guess what you're doing? You're actually trying to locate the bug or error in the program and correcting it. So a definition that you could use is debugging is a process of locating and correcting syntax and logic errors in a program. Cool. The next term that you should know is what we call syntax, right? And a syntax is basically a set of rules defining the structure of a particular programming language, right? And the word syntax is not unique to programming, right? It's general. Once you're trying to learn any particular language, whether it's human language or computer language, it's good if you understand the syntax very well, right? And as I said before, syntax is basically a set of rules defining the structure of statements in programming languages. The next term that you should know is what we call syntax error. A syntax error occurs when the code that you write violates the syntax or rules of the programming language. So let me repeat. If you write a code and you violate the rules of the particular programming language that you are using, then you produce what we call syntax errors. So syntax errors occur when the code violates the syntax or rules of the programming language, right? The next term that you should be aware of is what we call logic errors. And logic errors is basically a flaw in the design that causes inaccurate result when you run a program. Cool? For instance, let's say you accidentally put a division by 0 in your program. You know, dividing by 0 will give an error, right? Cool. Runtime errors, that's the next one. So runtime errors basically occur when you run a program. That's all I need to know. Runtime errors basically occur when you run a program. The next term that we'll be looking at is what we call gyron. And it's not the running like when Usain Bolt and Asapa run on dry surface. No. Gyron is basically a method of testing an algorithm or program by substituting values and see what will the output will be. Put it that way. Sorry. So gyron is basically testing of an algorithm by substituting values for variables and following the calculation thoroughly. Cool. Right. The next one that we'll look at is so we did gyron already. So the next one we'll look at is test data. Alright, so test data is basically sample data that mimics real data that will be inputted into your program. We normally use test data in gyron. So if you're testing your program manually, you're going through it line by line, which is a gyron or testing. The data that you use in your gyron is actually called test data, and it mimics the real data that will be inputted into your program. That's all you need to know. Alright, cool. So remember guys, we look at some terms that is commonly associated with programming. We look at testing, and we say testing is checking a program for errors. We look at execute, and we say execute is running a program to see the result. We look at debugging, and I remember saying that a bug is an error in a program. So if you're debugging a program, you're basically locating and correcting bug in that program. We look at syntax, and I remember saying that a syntax is basically a set of rules defining the structure of a particular programming language. We look at syntax errors, and again I remember saying a syntax error occurs when the code that you write violates the syntax of a programming language, right? We look at logic errors, and I did say that logic errors are flaws in the design that causes inaccurate result, right? So like dividing by 0 is an example of a logic error, or putting a greater than sign where you actually need a less than sign, right? Or multiplying when you should be adding. Those things are logic error, flaw in your reasoning. We look at runtime errors, and I did say that runtime error occurs when the program is running, right? When you execute a program, that is the time that the compiler or the computer will give you a warning or crash that, hey, there's an error in a program. We look at JIRUN, and I did say that JIRUN is basically a method of testing an algorithm or a pseudocode or a program by substituting values for variables and following the calculation thoroughly and see what happens. Cool. Most time when persons use JIRUN, they basically use JIRUN to look for errors in the program before they actually run it on the computer, right? Remember that. So most time when persons use JIRUN, they basically do it to see if they can spot any errors in the program before they actually type it or implement it on the program. The last term that we look at is test data, and I did say that test data is sample data that mimics real data the program will process once it is in production, right? So when you're doing your JIRUN or you're testing of your program manually or even on the computer, the data that is inputted into your program, that is called test data, right?